man's soul. And to this captain anything did Diabolus send these men, and a note under his hand, to receive them into his company. The contents of which letter were thus: Anything, my darling, the 3 men that are the bearers of this letter have a desire to serve me in the war. Nor know I better to whose conduct to commit them than to thine. Receive them therefore in my name, and, as need shall require, make use of them against Shaddai and his men. Farewell. So they came, and he received them, and he made of 2 of them sergeants, but he made Mr. Man's invention his ancient bearer. But this much for this, and now to return to the camp. They of the camp did also some execution upon the town, for they did beat down the roof of the Lord Mayor's house, and so laid him more open than he was before. They had almost with a sling slain my Lord Wilbywill outright, but he made a shift to recover again. But they made a notable slaughter among the aldermen, for with one only shot they cut off 6 of them, to wit, Mr. Swearing, Mr. Whoring, Mr. Fury, Mr. Stand to Lies, Mr. Drunkenness, and Mr. Cheating. They also dismounted the 2 guns that stood upon the tower over Eargate, and laid them flat in the dirt. I told you before that the king's noble captains had drawn off to their winter quarters, and had there entrenched themselves in their carriages, so as with the best advantage to their king, and the greatest annoyance to the enemy, they might give seasonable and warm alarms to the town of Man's Soul. And this design of them did so hit, that I may say they did almost what they would to the molestation of the corporation. For now could not Man's Soul sleep securely as before, nor could they now go to their debaucheries with that quietness as in times past. For they had from the camp of Shaddai such frequent, warm, and terrifying alarms, yea, alarms upon alarms, first at one gate, and then at another, and again at all the gates at once, that they were broken as to former peace. Yea, they had their alarms so frequently, and that when the nights were at longest, the weather coldest, and so consequently the season most unseasonable, that winter was to the town of Man's Soul a winter by itself. Sometimes the trumpets would sound, and sometimes the slings would whirl the stones into the town. Sometimes 10,000 of the king's soldiers would be running round the walls of Man's Soul at midnight, shouting and lifting up the voice for the battle. Sometimes again some of them in the town would be wounded, and their cry and lamentable voice would be heard, to the great molestation of the now languishing town of Man's Soul. Yea, so distressed with those that laid siege against them were they, that, I dare say, Diabolus their king had in these days his rest much broken. In these days, as I was informed, new thoughts, and thoughts that began to run counter one to another, began to possess the minds of the men of the town of Man's Soul. Some would say, "There is no living thus." Others would then reply, "This will be over shortly." Then would a third stand up and answer, "Let us turn to the King Shaddai, and so put an end to these troubles." And a fourth would come in with a fear, saying, "I doubt he will not receive us." The old gentleman too, the recorder, that was so before Diabolus took Man's Soul, he also began to talk aloud, and his words were now to the town of Man's Soul as if they were great claps of thunder. No noise now so terrible to Man's Soul as was his, with the noise of the soldiers and shoutings of the captains. Also things began to grow scarce in Man's Soul. Now the things that her soul lusted after were departing from her. Upon all her pleasant things there was a blast and burning instead of beauty. Wrinkles now, and some shows of the shadow of death, were upon the inhabitants of Man's Soul. And now, oh, how glad would Man's Soul have been to have enjoyed quietness and satisfaction of mind, though joined with the meanest condition in the world. The captains also, in the deep of this winter, did send by the mouth of Boanerges' trumpeter a summons to Man's Soul to yield up herself to the king, the great King Shaddai. They sent it once, and twice, and thrice, not knowing but that at some times there might be in Man's Soul some willingness to surrender up themselves unto them, might they but have the colour of an invitation to do it under. Yea, so far as I could gather, the town had been surrendered up to them before now, had it not been for the opposition of old incredulity, and the fickleness of the thoughts of my lord Will-be-will. Diabolus also began to rave, wherefore man's soul, as to yielding, was not yet all of one mind. Therefore they still lay distressed under these perplexing fears. I told you but now that they of the king's army had this winter sent 3 times to man's soul to submit herself. The first time the trumpeter went, he went with words of peace, telling them that the captains, the noble captains of Shaddai, did pity and bewail the misery of the now perishing town of man's soul, and were troubled to see them so much to stand in the way of their own deliverance. He said moreover that the captains bid him tell them that if now poor man's soul would humble herself and turn, her former rebellions and most notorious treasons should by their merciful king be forgiven them, yea, and forgotten too. And having bid them beware that they stood not in their own way, that they opposed not themselves, nor made themselves their own losers, he returned again into the camp. The second time the trumpeter went, he did treat them a little more roughly, for, after sound of trumpet, he told them that their continuing in their rebellion did but chafe and heat the spirit of the captains, and that they were resolved to make a conquest of man's soul, or to lay their bones before the town walls. He went again the third time, and dealt with them yet more roughly, telling them that now, since they had been so horribly profane, he did not know, not certainly know, whether the captains were inclining to mercy or judgment. Only, said he, they commanded me to give you a summons to open the gates unto them. So he returned and went into the camp. These 3 summonses, and especially the last 2, did so distress the town that they presently call a consultation, the result of which was this, that my lord Will-be-will should go up to Ear-gate, and there, with sound of trumpet, call to the captains of the camp for a parley. Well, the lord Will-be-will sounded upon the wall, so the captains came up in their harness with their 10,000s at their feet. The townsmen then told the captains that they had heard and considered their summons, and would come to an agreement with them, and with their king Shaddai, upon such certain terms, articles, and propositions as, with and by the order of their prince, they to them were appointed to propound. To wit, they would agree upon these grounds to be one people with them. 1. If that those of their own company, as the now Lord Mayor and their Mr. Forget-good, with their brave Lord Will-be-will, might, under Shaddai, be still the governors of the town, castle, and gates of man's soul. 2. Provided that no man that now serveth under their great giant Diabolus be by Shaddai cast out of house, harbour, or the freedom that he hath hitherto enjoyed in the famous town of man's soul. 3. That it shall be granted them that they of the town of man's soul shall enjoy certain of their rights and privileges, to wit, such as have formerly been granted them, and that they have long lived in the enjoyment of, under the reign of their king Diabolus, that now is and long has been their only lord and great defender. 4. That no new law, officer, or executioner of law or office shall have any power over them without their own choice and consent. These be our propositions or conditions of peace, and upon these terms, said they, we will submit to your king. But when the captains had heard this weak and feeble offer of the town of man's soul, and their high and bold demands, they made to them again, by their noble captain, the Captain Boanerges, this speech following. O ye inhabitants of the town of man's soul, when I heard your trumpet sound for a parley with us, I can truly say I was glad. But when you said you were willing to submit yourselves to our king and lord, then I was yet more glad. But when, by your silly provisos and foolish cavils, you laid the stumbling block of your iniquity before your own faces, then was my gladness turned into sorrows, and my hopeful beginnings of your return into languishing fainting fears. I count that old ill-pause, the ancient enemy of man's soul, did draw up those proposals that now you present us with as terms of an agreement. But they deserve not to be admitted to sound in the ear of any man that pretends to have service for Shaddai. We do therefore jointly, and that with the highest